All right, I'm getting the checkered flag. Is that the one that goes in racing? I'm getting a green light. So welcome everyone. My name is Rihanna. My pronouns are she, they. I'm thrilled to be supporting another fantastic panel event with the Slow Food USA Food and Farm Steering Committee. I have been part of the slow food community for over 10 years now and doing professional work on food and agriculture for about the same period of time, probably not a coincidence. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I've had the great pleasure of working with many folks on the panel today, either through work or through Slow Food. I'm excited for you all to meet them. If you're unfamiliar, the Slow Food and Farm Policy Steering Committee is a group of slow food leaders from all walks of life who are interested in the role that policy plays in shaping our food and farm system. Our goal is to position slow food as a leading voice in these important discussions and also to get more individuals and communities engaged in policy discussions like everyone that's joined us today. As a part of that effort, we periodically hold in-person and virtual events to highlight active areas of policy debate, and we'll be doing that with this panel today. This panel will focus on our essential farm and food chain workers, many of whom are immigrants or undocumented persons, and the public policies affecting them and their families, as well as the farmers, ranchers, processors, and all of us who rely on their labor. Our goal is to examine the equity and efficacy, or not, of past and proposed policies, and then to leave you all with some next steps for how to get engaged. So it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Jimena Bustillo, an agriculture and food policy journalist for Politico and a rising star in our community, someone who I am a big fan of their work. Jimena is based in Washington, D.C., but currently working out of Boise, Idaho, where she grew up. She is also the author of Politico's Morning Ag newsletter, which, if you don't already read that, it's a great source of policy insights. It's free every Monday, so you don't have to subscribe. Definitely recommend checking that out. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jimena.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rihanna. My pronouns are she and hers. And as Rihanna just said, this event is a discussion of immigration policy in the context of food and agriculture system workers. Before jumping into the complete panel discussion, I do want to share some context and provide a roadmap of current issues, and finally, introduce our great panelists. First, to provide some quick definitions, I believe all attendees should have access to a fact sheet, perhaps in the chat, that has key defined terms that our panelists may use and a brief history of farm work and farm work policy in the United States. So please feel free to review that and read it throughout the event as we kind of progress. But a brief recap of some quick history. The food system workforce of the US has long been employed by foreign workers. Mexico and the US entered an agreement to have Mexican workers come into every region of the US as an attempt to help with labor shortages during World War II. But the program in which they came through lasted far after the war had ended, and our food system to this day remains very dependent on foreign labor. Additionally, the 1986 Immigration and Control Act is seen as the last major effort to provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented individuals. With a bit of that historical context under our belt, we can now take a look at what the current issues are. First, according to the Agriculture Department, about half of all agricultural workers are undocumented, and more than 80% of hired crop farm workers are not migrant workers, but are considered settled. This means that they work at a single location within a 75-mile radius of their home. Next, farm workers are in a very unique working situation and often lack typical labor protections, including the ability to unionize and receive overtime pay. While some states have recently began adding more laws to protect farm workers, enforcement at the local level does often lack. Meanwhile, undocumented workers are less likely to report labor violations over fear of deportation. Some bills at the federal level are looking to change that. And finally, it's important to remember any data on farm and food system workers will largely be underreported due to immigration status concerns. But really, we have a couple panelists here to dive in a little bit deeper. First, we have Michael Marsh, President and CEO of the National Council of Agricultural Employers. Dave Rustin, Policy Director at the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. Maria de Luna, National Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. Mili Treveño Sauceda, Executive Director at Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. And we also have a guest farm worker, Carmen Obeso, a campesina leader with Campesinos a Campesinas Rural Coalition. So to kind of kick this off, let's start with about 1 minute quick introductions for each of our panelists. Michael, let's go ahead and start with you.
Okay, well, welcome to the webinar here. Michael Marsh, and I was raised in a small town in eastern Wyoming. My very first farm job, I got to work for 50 cents an hour. And actually, after I'd been there for about half of the month, I got a raise to 75 cents an hour. And I was in the money. I was only 12 years old, but you know, when you're 12, you have to have something to do in my hometown where I was raised. So I come to this issue having worked in the area of immigration reform now for several years. I used to run the Dairy Association in California, and also worked very extensively as we were trying to pass immigration reform in 2012 and 2013. We actually got Senate Bill 744 passed out of the Senate, but our challenge has always been legislatively to get something out of the House of Representatives. And finally, this year, we worked on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, and we were able to get, again, that bill passed out of the House of Representatives. Now we're on to the Senate, and hopefully we'll have some luck there as well, because we have to have agricultural labor reform.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Dave, do you want to go ahead and go next?
Yeah, I'm Dave Runson. I've been doing the job of policy director at CAF here in California. We represent small farmers in California and organic farmers. I grew up in Modesto, California. My family had a farm in Escalon, and we grew almonds and peaches. And I worked in a cannery for several years when I was going to college. So, you know, I have a lot of experience. I went through a PhD program at Berkeley on agricultural economics, and I've worked for many years in Mexico and in migration. And yeah, I worked on that 1986 legislation, and I've been working on this ever since. We keep trying to find some way to balance the interests of small farmers here with those of farm workers. And sometimes we find ourselves at odds with large-scale farming interests, particularly in the south of the United States. I think one interesting fact is California, here on the West Coast, we're very close to $15 an hour minimum wage, but there are states in the country that still have the federal $7.25 minimum wage. So we have very disparate ideas about how farm workers should be treated and paid in the United States.
Thank you for that. Maria, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Maria de Luna, National Policy and Advocacy Coordinator with Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. I actually come into this work both from a family history of cultivating and harvesting the land, and also from my studies that have really focused on the immigrant population from Latin America here in the United States. So welcome, I'm really happy to be here with you all. And I think we can pass it on to Mili.
Gracias, Maria. Thank you, Maria. Mili Treviño Sauceda with Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. I'm here in the Coachella Valley, and I grew up as a farm worker. I come from a family of migrants. I was born in the state of Washington. Two of my other siblings were born in the state of Washington. Two were born in Idaho, and then others were born in Mexico. And my father was raised in Texas. And so you can see, and then we ended up in California, and we worked around the Coachella Valley, and then Blythe area, Borrego Springs, and the Central Valley. And of course, living as farm workers was very, very hard situation because there was a lot of exploitation. There still is. There's a lot of different kinds of abuse happening, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some of that still happening. There are some wonderful companies that are doing great work because we're collaborating with them at the same time, and this is why we're collaborating with them. But there's issues that really resonated with my family and I in terms of why we got involved in terms of supporting the issues of farm workers. We lived it ourselves. We know what it is. And there are a lot of the things that were happening, and I'm talking about the 70s, 80s, still happening right now. And immigration reform, a comprehensive immigration reform is very, very important because of we are essential workers, and we feel that being essential is a good thing to think about. We should also be treated as essential workers, not just seen as essential workers. Thank you. Carmen, ¿quieres presentarte? You want to introduce yourself, Carmen?
Sí, hola, mi nombre es Carmen Obeso. Yo he sido campesina desde los 11 años de edad en México. Tengo...
Carmen, te voy a pedir que te
Mande.
metas a donde dice interpretación y lo pongas en español para que la intérprete te pueda interpretar al inglés. ¿Sí? ¿Te puedes poner el de español, por favor? I'm asking her to get into the Spanish icon interpretation.
Sí, estoy en
Okay,
español,
continúa,
pero
continúa.
sí. Bueno, no sé si ahí quedó, pero sí
está
dice
bien.
español.
Sí, continúa.
Ok. Sí, mi nombre es Carmen Obeso. Yo soy mexicana. Desde los 11 años yo trabajé en lo que es la agricultura en México. Tengo 14 años aquí. Desde que llegué aquí, pues he trabajado en diferentes cultivos. Tuve una visa de trabajo. Estuve a punto de renovar una tercera donde podía tener un estatus legal. Desafortunadamente por unos problemas en la compañía no fue así. Desde entonces yo ya tenía 2 hijos y decidí quedarme en este país. Entonces, pues es algo que, es algo que es un poco difícil porque así como yo hay muchos campesinos en este país que han tenido que venir a trabajar, dejando a las familias en su país. Y pues yo he estado apoyando en esta situación desde un principio con todas las propuestas que ha habido, precisamente porque pues es difícil que nosotros que nos han nombrado esenciales no podemos acceder a los recursos, aparte de que no podemos tener muchos, es difícil pues para nosotros no tener un estatus legal, y yo pienso que ya es hora de que lo tengamos, sobre todo por nuestros hijos, sobre todo por nuestras familias, por tener igualdad, que no nos excluyan, que no nos miren como menos. Somos trabajadores esenciales y pues merecemos tener una estabilidad legal en este país.
Gracias, Carmen.
Great. Thank you all for your quick introductions, and we're definitely going to dive way deeper into a lot of these issues. Kind of to kick off the conversation, anyone can kind of take this first question, but can we talk a little bit about the scope of foreign labor in our food system workers and why advocates are asking for change?
Gracias.
Dave, go ahead. I'm going to start calling on folks.
Well, I mean, as I think was said, right, we have a long history of immigrant labor in agriculture and more recently in food processing. And it cycled through different groups here in California, for instance, right, from the Chinese to the Japanese, the Sikhs, the Dust Bowl migrants, and then at World War II, right, the Mexican Bracero program, which persisted until the mid-60s. And then after that, we became very dependent on undocumented immigrants, certainly out here on the West Coast. And, you know, we had this legalization program in '86 where we legalized over 1 million farm workers by giving them green cards. And we haven't done anything like that since. So, you know, it's been a very long period of time. And this whole system has become more and more dependent on immigrant labor. A lot of food processing uses refugees in the Midwest to do the work. We also have this H-2B program, which brings in people from the Caribbean and some other areas, right, to work in food processing. So, you know, we basically evolved a system that is very dependent on immigrant workers.
Mhm. Thank you, David. So this is a good way for me to include, if that's okay with Jimena. How, as I was talking about earlier, as advocates, we're trying to make sure that people feel that they are needed. I know that many say that there were not only thousands, but more than 1 million farm workers that were legalized their status. They became permanent residents, and then many thousands of them became citizens, US citizens, and have continued doing good work and are good citizens. At the same time, many might be willing to leave agriculture, but it has to do more in terms of how the issues that they are still facing in the workplace. But we're here to talk a little bit more about the importance of if you have workers getting paid like everybody else, and at this point in time, if it's around $15 an hour, people will want to work for you. Why? Because it's a livable wage. Why? Because it's very, very important. So in terms of how that is important for them, because we've seen so many families living together, and it's not just because we're a community that likes to, be and act as a community, but it's because of the need. You don't have enough, you don't earn enough to be able to survive and sustain your family. And so families have to live together, or live in many more times, live in very deplorable conditions. So people try to find other jobs. But if the agricultural industry is working towards making sure that they can have enough workers as a workforce, let's make sure that we're giving them the protections, and giving them the respect, and paying them the way they everybody else should be getting paid. At the same time, H-2A workers here in California, we had very little programs before, because during the times there were more workers wanting to even undocumented workers that were willing to work in the agricultural industry, because it was more of a fair during, we're talking about the 90s and 2000s. But because of there's been, especially California has too long of a history of having high prices for everything. it's too much for them. Now, H2 workers, what we are very, very much concerned about is not people coming from other countries and get hired by the government or having permission actually by the government so that companies can hire them. It's really that companies are following the restrictions or the rules and regulations that they have to follow. And we have found that many are not necessarily following that. So, and I'm talking about various organizations that are part of Alianza that have found cases which are very, very sad in terms of the treatment and everything that says. Many of their visas are taken away, etc. So there's a lot of concerns that we have towards that. There are, I will say, and I will admit that there are good companies that are trying to do their best, but there are also many companies that are not. And we are very sad that those companies are not taking care of their workers the way they should.
And kind of on that note, I want to ask Carmen a question to, expand a little bit more on her experience, which she gave us a really good introduction for during her intro, but maybe go in deeper about what her time as a farm worker has been like, and especially during COVID, since that's something she started to talk about.
Sí, pues cuando yo estaba trabajando cuando empezó la situación del COVID, pues algo difícil fue que en el rancho donde yo estaba laborando no se estaba respetando las recomendaciones, porque como nunca fueron obligatorias, nunca fueron regulaciones, pues los patrones no estaban haciendo el caso de acerca de que se tenía que mantener distanciamiento. Bueno, en realidad nunca se dio material, nunca se dio guantes, nunca se dio mascarillas, no se mantuvo la higiene en los baños en donde todos estábamos tocando. Esa situación que vino a provocar pues que muchos de los campesinos pues cayeran enfermos, muchos de ellos no quisieron hablar por miedo, por temor de que los despidan, por temor de siempre pues al no tener una estabilidad legal, pues el temor de que no sabían si los iban a atender, si no saben si van a tener un beneficio por no tener documentos. Entonces fue una situación difícil, aparte de que pues como trabajadores esenciales, al tener que estar en los campos, tampoco estábamos teniendo alimentos y nunca se nos dio un privilegio en las tiendas como a muchas personas que se les daba de que dijeran tales horas los campesinos van a tener el beneficio de hacer compras. Entonces fue una situación difícil que pasamos como campesinos y pues gracias a nuestro proyecto pues empezamos a ayudar cuando menos aquí nuestra comunidad con despensas. Entonces pues sin embargo así pues seguimos teniendo poco apoyo.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And kind of on that note, we've seen how different situations can affect the entire industry as a whole, but sometimes some groups are affected a little bit more than others. So Maria, your organization focuses specifically on the advocacy for women farm workers. Can you talk a little bit about what are some unique barriers or issues facing this part of the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know as an organization that specifically works with women and children, families, that women in particular face other vulnerabilities, right, within an already marginalized group. This includes sexual harassment and abuse in the workplace, gender-based violence much more generally, Farm worker women tend to be, occupying roles that are often the least paid, with the least amount of benefits, if they have any benefits, and are often the first ones to be let go. And I can, pass this on to Millie and Carmen to talk a little bit more about, from their personal experiences, what that felt like, right, being a woman in the agricultural workforce. But what we sort of approach is that the various issues that impact farm workers, whether we're talking about immigration reform, as is the substance of this conversation, labor rights, issues on pesticide exposure and other sort of toxic chemical exposures, whether we're talking about health and nutrition, health and security, education, etc., that these are often the spaces in which the voices of women are left out. And as a result, policies that reflect those issues often do not cover women farm workers and women who work throughout our agricultural sector. But I want to give the opportunity for Millie and Carmen especially to be able to provide a little bit more insight about what that looks like on the ground.
Carmen, ¿quieres continuar platicando de otros problemas que de todas maneras estabas pasando durante el tiempo de todo este tiempo, ¿no?
Sí, pues la pandemia a mí me trajo otras consecuencias también, precisamente por ser una de las primeras personas que reclamó, que se quejó por la situación que estábamos pasando, que no se nos estaba cuidando. Pues sufrí de represalias, tuve problemas en mi trabajo, me alejaron. Cuando me alejaron sufrí una exposición a pesticidas. Después también tuve una lastimadura porque estaba haciendo un trabajo más pesado de que normalmente hacía. Pues toda esta situación pues me ha traído consecuencias, ya que pues tampoco he podido trabajar por 10 meses. Entonces, pues aparte de esto, pues debido a la situación migratoria, pues no he podido obtener las ayudas. Es una situación más difícil porque también aquí en el área donde estamos es muy cara las rentas, y si no tenemos documentos, no tenemos acceso a esos beneficios de bajo costos o servicios para personas que sí tienen los documentos para ayudarse con este tipo de situaciones, ya sea como rentas, y pues es una situación difícil, pienso yo, porque pues también como nosotros como campesinos tuvimos que dejar nuestros hijos. Si tenemos 2 hijos o 3 hijos más, no podemos costear el gasto de la niñera tampoco. Entonces, o muchas optamos por quedarnos, porque sería muy diferente si tuviéramos documentos, calificaríamos a lo mejor para algún plan donde nos ayudan con el cuidado de hijos, y sin embargo, como en nuestra situación, pues no calificamos para ese tipo de cosas.
And to add some of the issues that farm worker women and their families and a lot of men have gone through is like Carmen is talking about. Our organization, we are in more, I say 11 states, but we're in more than 11 states where, I mean, I'm talking about Florida, upstate New York, Indiana, Washington State, here in California, Texas, and all these states. We found women and their families where women had to decide in terms of taking their children to, because of COVID, they couldn't go to school. So who would take care of them? No, there was no way, there was no childcare whatsoever, and ending to this, as a part, had to decide either by staying at home, taking care of their children, or if there was the couple, the woman had to be the one deciding to stay home, and then only the male be the breadwinner at the time, and or take their children to work or keep their children of ages. And we found children ages 9 and younger taking care of their siblings. Situations where if they couldn't work, then how could they survive? Because there was no type of support or assistance. And I can only say that the majority of the time, it was more about women, even though they were working, they had to be calling home or the neighbor to make sure the neighbor was caring for their child. And then we found many women dealing with a situation of violence at home, because there was already violence at home against them, and then staying in that kind of situation did not help. And then people not willing to talk or say anything because I will say it very out loud, this past administration was very good in terms of intimidating our communities and making us feel that we had no right whatsoever to any kind of assistance, any kind of support, any kind of, anybody, reaching out to see who could give us anything that we needed. We did find many families because we're doing the distribution the same way Carmen is doing it over there in all Ventura County and parts of other like Santa Barbara County, because there's a lot of farm workers that come to where she's doing her distribution. We're doing it here in the Coachella Valley. And believe me, we found many women and their families with 2-3 days without any food whatsoever, and then having children with not having anything. And it was so hard. And not even milk. That was very, it just puts you into tears. It was too much. It was too much in terms of why we're doing this. And then people not wanting to say anything and knowing that they were not going to get any kind of support, or not even asking. They were even afraid to go and get tested because it was part of, they felt it was part of the government. It was part of what they could not get. And right now the vaccines is the same thing. It's about us coming and convincing people that they have that right. And we want the more people that are vaccinated, the more people that can help us be in a healthy environment and a healthy planet. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that part. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just so you know, we are getting questions in the chat. So we will get to those after we kind of finish this discussion for sure. But just kind of before we dive into the policy discussion of what bills are going through the House and the Senate right now on the Hill, the last background question I have is, why are H2A usages increasing? What farms and where do we see H2A used the most, and why? Maybe Michael or Dave can give us a little bit of context here.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. We overall in the United States, we've had an agricultural labor shortage for a period of time. When you look at the Census of Agriculture for 2017, which was the last census that was done, you had about 2.4 million agricultural workers in the United States. Out of that 2.4 million, you had about 200,000 that were H2A workers. And of course, that percentage that's H2A continues to expand as we continue to have challenges getting workers to come out on the farms. The average wage, according to the Farm Labor Survey for 2020, that was just published in February for 2020, was $14.62 an hour. That's across the entire United States, $14.62 an hour, more than twice the federal minimum wage. So I can't imagine that there's a farm worker, I hope there's not, a farm worker anywhere in the country that's working at the minimum wage, because that's just reprehensible in my opinion. So out of that workforce though, let's say you've got the 2.4 million less than 200,000 H2As, you've got another balance of domestic workers, both unauthorized as well as authorized, of about 2.2 million. And we know, according to the National Ag Worker Survey that the Department of Labor does, about half of those workers, the domestic workers, they're unauthorized. So about 1.1 million of those workers are unauthorized. We've got to keep that labor force. We have to keep those people working in agriculture from the employer's perspective. We need those people working. We've known forever that they're essential workers because we can't harvest a crop, or we can't plant a crop, we can't nurture a crop unless we've got workers that are there to do it. Now, of course, you are seeing some kind of shift into robotics and that type of thing, but that's just to try to have the U.S. Marketplace be competitive, because today about half the fresh fruit we consume in the United States is imported from a foreign country, typically Mexico or Canada. In Mexico, the wages are about $10 a day. In Canada, they're significantly less than what we pay here in the United States as well. But because of the trade agreements, USMCA, of course, being the last one, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, those products have access into our marketplace actually very easily. I was talking to my dad actually this week. He lives back in Wyoming, and he went to the grocery store and he was very upset because he found bell peppers that were coming from Canada. And he couldn't figure out why they were coming from Canada versus having come from California or Florida or Texas or someplace else. But because of the fact that they're able to just ship it in very easily, that price point at which the domestic farmer has to compete is very, very challenging. And a third of the fresh vegetables consumed in the United States today are coming from overseas as well. So last spring, as COVID came about, and we were struggling with our farmers to try to find personal protective equipment, which was so frustrating from the farmer's perspective, because you were competing with healthcare, you're competing with firefighters, you're competing with police officers for the same personal protective equipment. You want to talk about a disaster. Think about that. That was just terrible. And who knew what was going on with toilet paper? I still don't get that. But nonetheless, that's kind of neither here nor there. But we actually did a survey because we were getting some pressure from members of Congress saying, we can just do away with the H-2A program. We don't need those programs. So we surveyed all 50 of the state workforce agencies across the United States to find out exactly how many people had applied for these agricultural jobs for the 2 month period, 2.5 month period in the springtime after COVID hit. And what we found out, for about 200,000 jobs, we had 337 applicants that were domestic workers for those 200,000 positions. So H-2A continues to grow, and it will probably continue to grow as well. And a big part of that, of course, is the fact that the workforce we have here is aging. Whether they're domestic workers or they're either authorized or unauthorized, we've got an aging workforce in that population. And you have to have people coming to do the work who will do the work. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see this sorting out into robotics and robotics being used versus people being used. And that of course is a shame, because of course growing up where I did and being out with my dad when I was a child and he was sowing sugar beets for the farmer across the street, I have a great deal of respect for the people that do that work and show up every day, and they do a great job. And they have to always be, and one of the things that we teach within our organization, because we are very focused on compliance, is you have to treat people with dignity and respect. And that goes with regardless. People have to be known, they have to know that they're respected in what they do. And the essential nature of what a farm worker does in his or her job day in and day out, it can't be understated. They do a great job, and they protect American national security. Because if you don't have food on the table, if you can't get milk from the store, or beef or pork or apples or oranges or whatever it might be, you have no national security. So we have to have national security, and those farm workers are essential to that.
Yeah.
I just want to hop in with, we're at 15 of, and I know we have a lot on our plate, so just doing a quick time check.
Thank you, Rihanna. I appreciate that. And kind of on that note, let's pedal to the next question, which is opening up this policy discussion. So we currently have a couple bills going through Congress: the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, the U.S. Citizenship Act, and the Citizenship for Essential Workers. Some have moved further than others. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act passed the House and is still undergoing deep negotiations in the Senate, and others haven't moved at all, and they might not. Can you briefly discuss what differences are, what are the differences in the bills for farm workers and employers? Dave, let's hear from you.
Well, obviously the Farm Worker Modernization Act is the most focused on farm workers. Some of the other bills would legalize farm workers. The Farm Worker Modernization Act, we tried to participate in the process, and the guy who wrote it didn't let us. So we ended up opposing it because it basically puts all future farm labor in the context of H-2A in terms of this guest worker program. The problem with guest worker programs is the employers hold the visas and the workers have no rights. And it just has always seemed very un-American to us to have programs like that. Farm Worker Justice and other organizations have fought for years to try to make those programs as expensive and difficult as they can, but they're not well enforced by the government. And that has been documented over and over again, that there are good H-2A employers and bad H-2A employers. And so because everything is done in the context of H-2A, the people that we work with here in California, these smaller employers who employ people directly, they're not really in a position to use the program. Here on the West Coast, it's mainly used by very large farming operations using farm labor contractors. And the farm labor contractor thing is true in Washington, it's true in North Carolina, it's true in a number of the places where H-2A workers are being used. And so we asked, essentially that workers be given the visas. We just don't understand why we have to have guest worker programs for this instead of allowing the workers. I mean, the undocumented labor system, worked very well for the growers, maybe not for all the workers, but it allowed the workers to quit their job and go work for somebody else. Under guest worker programs, you can't do that. And so, so that's one of our principal objections. Of course, there's E-Verify. There's a whole series of things in that bill. My understanding is that it's simply groups from the south of the United States insisted on some of these things that people from California and the West Coast maybe didn't really want. And so we've basically created a situation where, at least from our point of view, it's not going to benefit either the workers or the smaller farms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Neely, I don't know if you wanted to say something.
Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, what Dave laid out is sort of like that initial proposal, right? The Farm Workers Modernization Act. There are these other two, and I just kind of want to go over them really quickly. The Citizenship for Essential Workers Act would provide an expedited pathway to citizenship for about 5 million essential workers, which includes workers in agriculture. And the most broad of these proposals is the U.S. Citizenship Act, which would provide a pathway to legalization and citizenship for the approximately 11 million undocumented people who are in this country. It includes an immediate adjustment of status for people with DACA, TPS, and farm workers who are immediately eligible to apply for a green card, and then adjust their status after 3 years to U.S. citizens. It expands labor and employment protections, especially for those in the agricultural workforce. It reinforces protections for whistleblowers, as well as people from vulnerable groups, and that includes survivors of gender-based violence. It expands humanitarian UNT visas, as well as protection channels in Central America. It does a couple of other things, but overall, these are the three major proposals. And on Alianza's sort of front, the kinds of proposals that we're advancing really need to be central to our major tenet, which is keeping families unified, making sure that immigrant and migrant survivors of violence, including farm worker women, have the protections that they need for both themselves and their families, and that workers have, the freedom of movement, that they're not tied to any one employer, and that they have the protections that they need to do the essential work that they do.
Yeah, and so the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is the bill, that we seem to be talking about a little bit more the most. It's made it the furthest, and it's undergoing negotiations in the Senate, largely led by Senators Michael Bennet, a Democrat from Colorado, and Mike Crapo, a Republican from Idaho. Now, this does have bipartisan support, but not everybody fully loves it, including advocates. What are the political holdups here?
I'll jump in. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act is actually in 3 different titles. Title 1 talks about legalization of the existing workforce and continued employment in agriculture for earned status for those farm workers. Title 2 looks at reforms of the H-2A program. And that piece was negotiated, of course, with United Farm Workers. Farm Worker Justice was in the room typically as that was being discussed as well. And then Title III is E-Verify and mandatory E-Verify. And that's been a political hot potato, as you know, for quite some time. But E-Verify would not come into place until you had the other pieces, of course, fully implemented. So that is one of the challenges. And Dave, I got to tell you, if you know of somebody that's holding on to visas, let USCIS know, because that is not okay. They're not allowed to hold visas for workers who are H-2A. Please turn them in.
Yeah. The issue is that sometimes they don't, workers don't want to say anything because they're going to be blacklisted and they're not going to be hired again. That's what usually is happening. People are not willing to say anything, and which is very sad because they're threatened.
Well, then the law doesn't get enforced if we don't turn them in.
I understand, but then they don't get to come back.
Yeah, and there is, a lot of this fear, right? This back and forth between, what some folks are doing is illegal versus, what are the individual retributions for those who speak out. And at the local level, some states have began passing individual laws to increase labor protections to farm and meatpacking workers. Washington has been one of the most recent, and just last week, Colorado passed its own bill through its legislature, and their governor is expected to sign it soon. He appears to be very in support. But is this enough to ensure that protections are not only given, but upheld?
No. I mean, these are really welcomed first steps, but you cannot have a patchwork of protections for workers without extending them across the board. Bottom line, we cannot have, workers in certain states able to have certain protections and safeguards that they then can't have if they migrate towards work. And we know that that is something that happens quite often, which is why we are, both supporting and advancing immigration proposals like the U.S. Citizenship Act, like the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, because we know that these sorts of things that we're talking about cannot be acceptable cost of doing business, right? If we're saying that these workers are essential, they need essential protections and supports, and that includes legal status, both for them, for their families, and their communities. I mean, this is something that actually came up during our convening a couple of weeks ago. One of our members said, we are people who play it all to be here, right? To be able to improve our lives and improve the lives of our loved ones. How can we then turn our backs to other people who are in the exact same situation, but maybe working in other industries, right? And this is sort of what we keep saying about a just and equitable pathway to citizenship for all, because the security and livelihood of one of us is tied to the security and livelihood of all of us, right? And so with that said, we need protections, legal protections for everyone. These, farm worker rights bills, again, are really great initial steps, but they don't go far enough for what's actually needed.
I appreciate Maria's comments, because to me, as I'm thinking about it from the employer's perspective, it has to do with the ethical treatment of the people you're working with. People need to be treated ethically, regardless of being here documented or otherwise. That has to happen. And unfortunately, in some instances, it does not. And those circumstances, those folks actually need to be held to account.
Well, but if the farm workers were legal, if they could quit the job and go work for somebody else without fear of being deported, it seems to me, always has seemed to me, that that would solve a great deal of the problem. The fact that either they're undocumented or that they're a guest worker puts them in a status that doesn't give them much power vis-a-vis the employers. You know, and legalizing the workers, of course, would make them eligible for unemployment and other welfare transfers and things that, you know, would be really important because people don't make all that much money. It's a seasonal job often, you know, and so I think, you know, it's just legalization of the labor force, I've said for 30 years, you know, would go a long way to curing this problem of poverty in these rural areas.
And resiliency, right? Because legal status isn't just something that would greatly benefit workers and their families. It would also benefit the resiliency of our farm and food systems, right? That we have seen nearly collapse during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Just,
And Title I, you know, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act addresses the legalization of the existing workforce. Dave, I don't know if you're aware, but also within the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, there's also a pilot project with regard to portability of visas, so that if you were an H-2A worker that was here on a visa, to a limited extent, I think it's like 20,000, they could go from employer to employer on a pilot basis to see how that works out. I don't know if that assuages your concerns, but at least it's a start.
Well, I proposed that to the California Farm Bureau, but without the H-2A aspect of it. You know, H-2A requires you to provide housing, right? How does some farmer out in a very rural area construct housing for H-2A workers? You know, it's the housing aspect of the thing is the most expensive thing in California. What can be more expensive in California or Washington than housing? You know, in the state of Washington, the state government is subsidizing these large congregate housing facilities. In California, we have a law, it's against the law for the state of California to do that, which is a law that the UFW put forward. And so, you know, it just, as a result, you know, the people are using old warehouses and they're renting motels and so on and so forth. And this is being done by farm labor contractors. But, you know, the ability of the farmers we work with to do that kind of stuff is really zero. And so this constant drumbeat of guest worker, H-2A, you know, is the thing that really, it seems to me, in the way of this Farm Worker Modernization Act succeeding.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to jump in because we are running short on time. We have a couple questions from the chat that I want to prioritize. I am going to cut my closing section because it's not as important. I'll just say that the Policy Steering Committee is doing some really exciting stuff and we have some amazing resources. So I am going to just paste the link to our landing page in the chat. You can find some really great stuff. And to preview coming up, our next policy panel will likely focus on the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act, which covers food nutrition for millions of children and infants. So it's going to be a great session. So keep your eyes peeled for that. So now I have given Jimena some of the questions. So I'm going to let her throw them out in our last few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rihanna. So let's just try and keep this as short as possible to give as many people the opportunity to respond. A question that we got was, who are the elected policymaking allies that we can trust to be having these conversations with?
Well, we're working with Senator Bennett as well as Senator Crapo now on the Senate side, trying to get that Senate bill going. You know, one of the challenges I think maybe it was Maria raised it a couple of times, was the other pieces of legislation that are presently pending before the Congress. It's very challenging to get that 60 votes out of the Senate. I think, as Jimena will attest to, and that's why, from I think the employer's perspective, we've been very focused on seeing if we can get a companion bill out of the Senate for FWMA, which, by the way, Dave, also includes money for farm worker housing.
Mhm.
I mean, I would add also, Senator Padilla, Senator Warren, Representative Ruiz. There are many, many others, but I think that the other larger sort of question is that it ought to be all of them, right? To Michael's point, it is difficult to sort of get to those 60 votes, but people's lives are on the line, right? And this is why we need people here on this webinar and everywhere else to be contacting their representatives, right? And saying that we need a just and equitable pathway to citizenship for all. We have needed it yesterday and the yesterdays before that. We need it now.
Mhm. And kind of moving on to the next question that was sent to us, why are we not mobilizing around legalization efforts like the amnesty in '86 to get people visas, work permits, and permanent status?
Didn't we try that before? That was what 2 years ago. We were doing it. What we would call the blue card bill.
Yeah.
And what happened? I mean, it's about us really trying to look forward and having longer conversations with all these Congress people that if they really want to advance with this country, I think there's more right now, more than 11 million that need to have the support. The blue card bill was going to allow not only the worker to become legalized, but also their families.
Mhm.
And there was a good pathway for citizenship, and with less years than what the other, especially the Farm Worker Modernization, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is doing. We are very, very much concerned that it is talking about bipartisan, but in reality, there's interests about trying to move forward to getting more H-2A workers, where there's less possibilities of these workers to really get engaged in terms of organizing and trying to exercise their rights. Because if they say anything, they're not going to get hired from back, because, they'll talk to each other. The companies talk to each other. They'll say, no, don't hire that one. It's the troublemaker. Troublemaker? When the one that's causing the trouble is the company itself. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I said what I need to say.
Well, yeah, the blue card bill was introduced by Dianne Feinstein for 20 years running, I think. And, I mean, the fundamental problem you have is the anti-immigrant forces, the Stephen Millers of the world, have demonized legalizing people. And, I'm not clear that you can get 10 Republicans to vote for it in the Senate. Mhm.
I know we are not to the bottom of the question list, but because it is a minute or two after 3, and I forgot, so I am sorry. I want to give everyone the chance, maybe a sentence or two, given the time, an action item. So if there's something you want people to do next, it can be as simple as go to our website or follow us on Twitter, or it can be something more complex, show up to an event, sign on to something. So I would love for folks to give a final takeaway. Maria, maybe we can start with you.
Please contact your representatives and emphasize to them the need to have a just and equitable pathway to citizenship for all. Please visit our website and follow us on social media. And always remember, farm worker women and other women throughout our agricultural system are disproportionately affected by these policies and more. And so please center their needs and concerns when you're thinking about policy and best practices.
Please provide support to workers in different ways. There's many very good organizations that are trying to do the best to try to support the community and are bringing out the issues because of what I've been saying. Workers many more times are threatened. They're not just, it's not just a feeling of fear. It's people are being threatened. And this is why it's good that many organizations are involved to try to represent, but engaging them really works. So look us up at Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, and yes, we we have a lot of like social media in terms of, so you can see all the different groups that are involved, trying to make a difference. Thank you.
The last time federal legislation was passed relative to immigration reform and agricultural labor was in 1986. We can't wait another 35 years to get these problems solved. I would chime in with Ria. Please contact your representatives, contact your members of the United States Senate. We have an opportunity to do something. And Dave, I'm really hopeful that we can get 60 votes out of the U.S. Senate to see if we can pass a companion bill. It's going to be a heavy lift, but at the same time, it's a lift worth making.
Well, I'm all for passing something that would legalize undocumented workers, that's for sure. Slow Food has a lot of relationships with farmers. I would encourage people to talk to farmers they buy food from and get the farmers involved and support legalizing the workers. You know.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Definitely feel free to share this panel on your Facebook. We are Facebook Living. And a quick plug to subscribe for the morning agriculture newsletter at Politico. Thank you to our panelists, and everyone have a good afternoon.
You as well. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you.